I never imagined at 65 years old I would stare at my only son's wedding invitation with my name crossed out in angry black marker. For months, Thomas had been punishing me for refusing to sell my home to fund his extravagant wedding to Vanessa. Little did he know, on the morning he was set to marry her, I would receive a phone call that would change both our lives forever, a call that would reveal the painful truth he had been hiding from everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation sat on my kitchen table, a beautiful piece of cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing announcing Thomas and Vanessa's spring wedding at Oakridge Estate. When it arrived 3 months ago, I'd proudly displayed it on my refrigerator, running my fingers over the elegant lettering each morning while making my tea. Now it was defaced, my name violently scratched out, with Thomas's handwritten note. "Since you've chosen not to support our future, we've decided you shouldn't be present for its beginning." 30 years of memories surrounded me in this modest bungalow on Maple Street. The yellow curtains James had hung still framed the window above the sink, though sunlight had faded them over the years. Through that window I could see the garden. My late husband had started, azaleas in full bloom now, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the heaviness in my heart. I'd tended that garden alone for 12 years since the heart attack that took James from us far too soon. Thomas was our miracle child, born after 7 years of fertility treatments and countless disappointments. James and I had saved for years to buy this house, wanting to provide a stable home where our child could thrive. I remembered how Thomas had learned to walk in the living room, his tiny hands gripping the coffee table James had crafted from reclaimed oak. How the kitchen had been filled with laughter during weekend pancake breakfasts, flour dusting our faces as James taught Thomas to flip the perfect pancake. The backyard still bore the faded chalk markings from Thomas's architectural drawings. As a teenager, his early designs etched into the concrete patio where James had encouraged his creativity. After James died when Thomas was 24, I'd worked double shifts as a nurse at Mercy Hospital to ensure Thomas could complete his master's degree in architecture without student loans. Those years were a blur of exhaustion, coming home at midnight, sleeping a few hours, then rising before dawn for the early shift. But seeing Thomas graduate at the top of his class had made every sacrifice worthwhile. His first commission, a small library renovation, was commemorated in a photo that still hung in my hallway. Thomas and me, arms around each other, his face beaming with pride and promise. When had that grateful, sensitive young man transformed into someone who could treat his mother with such callous disregard? The change had been gradual, I realized. As Thomas's architecture firm found success, he'd moved in increasingly exclusive circles. His clothes became more expensive, his tastes more refined, his visits home less frequent. Then 3 years ago, at 36, he met Vanessa at a charity gala where he'd been honored for designing a new wing of the City Art Museum. Vanessa Bradford came from old money, her family name adorning buildings across the city. At 32, she'd already made partner at a prestigious marketing firm, specializing in luxury brands and high-end real estate. She was polished in a way that made me immediately conscious of my practical clothes and aging hands that bore the marks of a lifetime of hard work. "Mother," Thomas had said during their first visit to my home, the formal address immediately setting my nerves on edge. "Vanessa and I have some exciting news." They'd announced their engagement over tea in my living room, Vanessa's diamond ring catching the light as she extended her hand for my inspection. The stone was enormous, ostentatious in a way that seemed at odds with the values I thought I'd instilled in Thomas. "It's lovely," I'd said, meaning the engagement rather than the ring. "I'm happy for you both." A flash of disappointment had crossed Vanessa's face, as if she'd expected more effusive praise for the jewelry. That should have been my first warning. For months, our relationship progressed cordially if distantly. I was invited to tasteful engagement parties where I felt conspicuously out of place among Vanessa's friends with their designer clothes and practiced laughter. Thomas seemed different in these settings, more reserved with me, more eager to impress Vanessa's parents and their social circle. The breaking point came 6 months ago over dinner at Le Chateau, a restaurant so expensive I'd had to dip into my modest savings just to afford the meal. They'd ordered champagne before dropping their bombshell. "We've secured Oakridge Estate for the ceremony," Vanessa announced, showing me photos of manicured gardens and a grand ballroom on her phone. "It's where my parents held their 30th anniversary party. The waiting list is usually 2 years, but Daddy pulled some strings." "How wonderful," I'd said, genuinely happy for their excitement, despite the knot forming in my stomach as they detailed plans for a 5-course dinner for 300 guests, custom-designed floral arrangements, and a renowned string quartet. "Mom," Thomas had said, his voice taking on a tone I'd come to recognize when he wanted something significant. "The thing is, with the deposit for Oakridge, plus the honeymoon villa in Bali, and the down payment we're saving for the penthouse in Riverside, Towers." "What Thomas is delicately trying to say," Vanessa interrupted, reaching for my hand with perfectly manicured fingers, "is that we need your help to make this happen properly. Your house must be worth at least $450,000 in this market. If you sold it, you could live comfortably at Sunny Pines Senior Living while helping us start our married life the right way." The presumption stunned me into momentary silence. They'd already researched my home's value? Selected a retirement facility without any input from me? "I'm not selling my home," I finally managed, withdrawing my hand from Vanessa's. "This is where James and I built our life, where Thomas grew up. My neighbors are like family." Thomas's face hardened in a way I'd never seen before. "This is exactly why I didn't want to ask her," he said to Vanessa, as if I weren't sitting right there. "She's always been stubborn about the house, even though it's obviously too much for her to maintain alone." "I maintain it just fine," I said, my voice tightening as I thought of the garden I tended daily, the small repairs I'd learned to handle myself after James died. "And I'm not ready for a retirement home." "It's not a home, it's a community," Vanessa corrected, her smile not reaching her eyes. "With activities and people your own age, you'd be much happier there than rattling around in that outdated bungalow by yourself." What followed was a conversation that still made my chest ache to recall. Thomas accused me of selfishness, of holding on to the past at the expense of his future. Vanessa suggested that my reluctance proved I didn't truly care about Thomas's happiness or standing among her family's social circle. "Either you help us start our lives properly," Thomas had finally declared, "or don't expect to be part of that life. Your choice, Mom." They'd left abruptly after that, leaving me to pay the exorbitant bill alone. For weeks, I'd tried to mend the rift, calling, texting, even appearing at Thomas's office only to be turned away by an apologetic receptionist. Then, 3 weeks ago, the defaced invitation had arrived, making the exclusion official. That evening, sitting on my porch swing as sunset painted the sky in watercolor hues of pink and orange, I made a difficult decision. Despite everything, I would attend the wedding. Not to create a scene, but simply to bear witness to my only child's marriage, even if from a distance. I would sit quietly at the back, holding space in my heart for the son I'd raised and still loved unconditionally. "Mrs. Peterson waved from next door as she walked her corgi, calling out, "Beautiful evening, Eleanor." Her simple kindness nearly brought me to tears. This was my community, my home. The thought of being uprooted to finance Thomas and Vanessa's extravagance made my heart ache anew. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, I couldn't possibly have known that the morning of Thomas's wedding would bring a phone call that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my son's relationship and the woman he was about to marry. The week before Thomas's wedding passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Each morning, I awoke with the same hollow ache in my chest, the reality of my exclusion hitting me anew. I would instinctively reach for my phone, hoping against hope to see a message from Thomas. Perhaps an apology, a reconsideration, any sign that he had softened his position. But the screen remained stubbornly blank. I found myself wandering through the house during those days, touching objects that connected me to my son's childhood, the height markings on the kitchen door frame tracking his growth from age 3 to 16, the slightly crooked bookshelf he and James had built together for his 10th birthday, the framed certificate from his first architectural competition win in high school. Each memento told the story of a boy loved deeply and unconditionally, a story that seemed increasingly disconnected from the man who had crossed my name off his wedding invitation. On Wednesday, I ventured into the attic, a space I rarely visited since James's passing. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the small window as I carefully navigated around boxes labeled in James's precise handwriting. Christmas decorations, Thomas's school projects, family photos 1980s. I was searching for something specific, something I hadn't looked at in years. The cedar chest in the corner had been a wedding gift from James's parents. I knelt beside it, my knees protesting the hardwood floor, and lifted the creaking lid. The familiar scent of cedar and lavender sachet enveloped me as I carefully moved aside layers of preserved memories. My wedding dress, now yellowed with age, James's military service medals, baby blankets I couldn't bear to part with after Thomas outgrew them. At the bottom lay what I was seeking, a small leather journal with a worn spine. James had started keeping it the day we learned I was pregnant, with Thomas, recording his thoughts about impending fatherhood and his hopes for our child's future. After James died, I had placed it in the cedar chest, finding it too painful to read but too precious to discard. Now, I carried it downstairs to the sunroom James had built as a surprise for my 50th birthday, settling into the wicker chair where afternoon light created a perfect reading nook. With trembling fingers, I opened the journal, James's familiar handwriting bringing tears to my eyes immediately. April 15th, 1983. We're having a baby. After so many disappointments, it doesn't seem real. The doctor said everything looks good. At 12 weeks. Eleanor was so pale during the appointment, gripping my hand like she might float away if she let go. I'm terrified and exhilarated all at once. What kind of father will I be? Dad was so distant, so critical. I want to be different. I want our child to feel secure in our love, to know they're enough exactly as they are. I turned the pages slowly, tracing James's journey from nervous, expectant father to devoted dad, his pride in Thomas evident in every entry. December 8th, 1983. Thomas James Sullivan arrived at 3:42 this morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces of absolute perfection. I've never known love like this before. I held him against my chest, this tiny human we created, and promised him the world. June 30th, 1987. Tommy built the most extraordinary tower with his blocks today. He was so frustrated when it kept falling, but he didn't give up, kept trying different approaches until he found one that worked. Eleanor says I'm reading too much into a toddler's play, but I swear there's something special about how his mind works, how he sees structure and space. September 5th, 1991. First day of 2nd grade. Tommy was nervous but trying not to show. Reminds me so much of myself at that age. Sensitive but determined not to let anyone see it. I need to make sure he knows it's okay to feel things deeply, that vulnerability isn't weakness. Eleanor's better at drawing him out than I am. She always knows the right questions to ask. The entries continued throughout Thomas's childhood and adolescence, capturing moments of triumph and struggle. James's unwavering love providing steady witness to our son's evolution. The final entries were written during James's last months, when he knew his time was limited. November 16th, 2011. Tommy graduated with honors today. His architectural models were the highlight of the exhibition. I was so weak I nearly couldn't attend, but I'm glad I pushed through. The pride on Eleanor's face while watching our son, that's an image I want to take with me when the time comes. She sacrificed so much for him, especially these past 2 years during my illness. I worry about them both after I'm gone. Tommy's so focused on making his mark that he sometimes misses what's truly important. I hope he realizes one day that his mother's unwavering support is worth more than any career achievement. December 3rd, 2011, asked Tommy to look after Eleanor when I'm gone. He promised he would, tears in his eyes. He's a good man at his core, but he's ambitious in a way neither Eleanor nor I ever were. I fear that ambition might lead him to value the wrong things, to chase approval from the wrong people. I've tried to teach him that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in love, in community, in living with integrity. I can only hope those lessons have taken root. By the time I closed the journal, twilight had fallen, and tears had dried on my cheeks. James had seen it all. Thomas's sensitivity, his intelligence, his ambition, but also the shadow side, his vulnerability to external validation, his desire to belong among those he admired. The seeds of the conflict we now faced had been present even then, noticed by a father whose observations were unclouded by the blind devotion I sometimes fell prey to as a mother. The following day, I visited Beatrice, my closest friend since nursing school. At 70, she had a directness that came from decades in emergency medicine and a wisdom I had relied on since James's death. Her small apartment was cluttered with mementos from her travels. She had never married, choosing instead to work with Doctors Without Borders for much of her career. The scent of chai tea filled her kitchen as she listened to my plan to attend the wedding, despite my exclusion. "Are you sure that's wise, Ellie?" she asked, concern evident in her faded blue eyes. "Thomas and that woman of his could make a very public scene." "I need to be there," I explained, cupping the warm mug between my hands. "Not to disrupt anything, just to witness. He's my only child, Bea. How could I not be present on his wedding day, even if he thinks he doesn't want me there?" Beatrice studied me for a long moment. "You've always had more grace than sense," she finally said with a sigh. "If you're determined to go, at least let me drive you. I don't want you facing this alone." Her offer brought fresh tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. "That would mean everything." "What will you wear?" she asked practically, moving to her overstuffed closet. "You'll need to look dignified but understated. Nothing that screams estranged mother of the groom." We spent the afternoon sorting through our combined wardrobes, finally settling on a dove-gray dress with a subtle silver thread woven through the fabric. It was elegant without being flashy, respectful without being drab. Beatrice loaned me a vintage pearl necklace to complete the ensemble. "There," she said, as I stood before her full-length mirror. "You look like exactly what you are, a woman of substance and heart who deserves better than she's been given." The night before the wedding, I barely slept. A spring storm rolled through after midnight, thunder rattling the windows as if echoing my turbulent emotions. By dawn, the rain had cleared, leaving the world washed clean and fragrant. I rose early, watching the sunrise from the garden bench where James and I had shared countless morning coffees. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," I whispered, as if he could hear me. "But I can't bear the thought of not being there, even if Thomas never knows I came." I dressed carefully, applied light makeup to disguise the shadows beneath my eyes, and fastened Beatrice's pearls around my neck. At precisely 8:30 a.m., I heard her car pull into the driveway. The ceremony wasn't until 11 Siao, but Oakridge Estate was on the opposite side of the city, and we wanted to arrive early enough to slip into the back row unnoticed. I took one last look around my beloved home before picking up my handbag. On the entry table sat a small wrapped package, A wedding gift for Thomas and Vanessa that I had no expectation of being able to deliver. It contained an antique silver compass that had belonged to James's grandfather, a symbol of finding one's true direction in life. Inside, I'd tucked a card with a simple message: "May you always find your way home. With love, Mom." Just as my hand touched the doorknob, the phone rang. I hesitated, glancing at the clock. Beatrice was waiting. We needed to leave. The phone continued its insistent ring. Something compelled me to answer it, some instinct I couldn't explain. "Hello?" I said, expecting perhaps a telemarketer or wrong number. The voice that responded was female, unfamiliar, and clearly distressed. "Is this Eleanor Sullivan? Thomas Sullivan's mother?" "Yes," I replied cautiously. "Who's calling, please?" "My name is Rebecca Martin. We've never met, but—" Her voice caught on what sounded like a sob. "I think there's something you need to know about your son's wedding, about Vanessa. I don't know who else to call." Through the window, I could see Beatrice checking her watch, ready to whisk me to a wedding that suddenly felt even more complicated than it had moments before. "I'm listening," I said quietly, sinking into the chair beside the phone table as Rebecca began to speak, her words gradually unraveling everything I thought I knew about my son's relationship and the woman he was about to marry in less than 3 hours. "I'm Vanessa's former roommate," Rebecca explained, her voice trembling slightly. "We shared an apartment for 2 years before she met Thomas. We were close, or at least I thought we were until—" She paused, seeming to gather her courage. Signaled through the window to Beatrice, who nodded and settled back in her car seat, understanding from my gesture that we would be delayed. "Until what?" I prompted gently. "Until I discovered what she was really like," Rebecca continued. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you something first. Did Thomas or Vanessa ask you to sell your home to help pay for their wedding?" The question landed like a physical blow. How could this stranger know about our private family conflict? "Yes," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "They did." Rebecca's bitter laugh held no humor. "That's her pattern. That's why I had to call you. You're not the first, Mrs. Sullivan. Vanessa has done this before." My hand tightened on the receiver. "Done what exactly?" "Vanessa Bradford has been engaged 3 times in the past 7 years. Rebecca said flatly. Each time she targeted men from successful professional backgrounds but with limited family wealth, men whose parents owned property or had retirement savings. Each time she orchestrated a scenario where the parents were pressured to liquidate assets to fund an extravagant wedding. I sank deeper into the chair, my mind racing. "Are you saying she's some kind of con artist?" "I'm saying she's calculated," Rebecca clarified. "The first time I thought it was coincidence. Her fiancé Michael's parents sold their vacation cabin to pay for a wedding at the St. Regis. The engagement ended mysteriously 2 weeks before the ceremony, after the non-refundable deposits were paid, and the parents had already sold their property. And the second time, I barely managed to ask. Daniel's mother took out a reverse mortgage on her home to fund their Plaza Hotel wedding. Same story. Engagement broken off just before the ceremony, but not before Vanessa had access to several accounts they'd opened together." Rebecca paused before continuing. "In both cases, she walked away with substantial cash and gifts, while the families were left devastated financially and emotionally. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. If this is true, why hasn't anyone reported her? Pressed charges? Pride, embarrassment, and legally it's complicated. She never technically stole anything. The men gave her access willingly. The parents willingly sold their properties or took out loans. And Vanessa always creates situations where she appears to be the wronged party when she ends the engagements." My mind flashed to Thomas's defense of Vanessa whenever I'd expressed, even mild reservations, how he'd become increasingly isolated from his old friends since their relationship began. how Vanessa had subtly directed their social life toward her circle exclusively. "How do you know all this?" I asked, suspicion creeping into my voice despite the ring of truth in her words. "Because I helped her once," Rebecca admitted, shame evident in her tone. "With Daniel, the second fiancé, I corroborated a story she created about him having an inappropriate relationship with a colleague. It wasn't true, but I backed her up because she convinced me he had wronged her. Later, I found evidence that she'd planned it all along, including text messages about targeting his mother's house specifically. Why are you telling me this now? Today, of all days?" "Because last night she called me, drunk, laughing about how she'd managed to drive a wedge between you and Thomas, how she'd convinced him you were selfish and unsupportive." Rebecca's voice cracked. She said, and I'm quoting, "Another sentimental old bat who'll probably die alone in a nursing home while I enjoy her liquidated equity." The cruelty of the words stole my breath. I closed my eyes, pieces falling into place. Vanessa's immediate focus on my house, her practiced sympathy when discussing my situation, her subtle encouragement of Thomas's worst tendencies toward status-seeking and material acquisition. "I know I should have come forward sooner," Rebecca continued. "But she has a way of making people afraid. She's vindictive when crossed. After I confronted her about Daniel, she spread rumors that got me fired from my job. I had to move cities, to start over. Why risk calling me now then? Because I can't live with myself if I let it happen again. Last night's call was my breaking point. The way she talked about you, about Thomas." She hesitated. "There's more, Mrs. Sullivan. Something about financial trouble Thomas doesn't know about." Beatrice had gotten out of her car now, concern evident on her face as she approached the front door. I waved her inside, my mind reeling. "What financial trouble?" I asked. "Vanessa lost her job 3 months ago. She's been pretending to go to work, but she was fired for falsifying client billings. She's deeply in debt, credit cards, shopping addiction, gambling. She needs Thomas's income and other sources of cash. Your house equity would solve a lot of her problems." The doorbell rang, Beatrice using her key to let herself in. She found me pale-faced in the entryway, the phone clutched in my white-knuckled hand. "Ellie, what's wrong?" she whispered, taking in my shocked expression. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you still there?" Rebecca asked through the phone. "Yes," I managed. "Do you have proof of any of this? Thomas won't believe me without evidence. He's very much in love with her." Even as I said the words, I wondered if what Thomas felt was actually love, or if he too had been manipulated into a simulacrum of it. I have screenshots of text conversations, copies of the previous wedding contracts, photos of the properties her other fiancé's parents sold, and a recording of last night's call. She paused. "I started recording our conversations after what happened with Daniel, for my own protection." I glanced at the clock. 9:45 a.m. The ceremony was scheduled for 11. "Can you send these to me immediately? By email?" "Already done." I sent everything to the address listed in the alumni directory from your nursing school. "I hope it's current." I confirmed the address, then asked the question weighing heaviest on my heart. Why target Thomas? Why my son specifically? Rebecca's sigh carried years of regret. Vanessa researches potential marks carefully. She looks for men who are professionally successful but not independently wealthy. Men who are close to their parents, especially if those parents own property free and clear. Men who might be a bit insecure socially, eager to impress. And, I'm sorry to say this, men who might be somewhat estranged from one parent, creating vulnerability she can exploit. The description fit Thomas with painful accuracy. After James died, Thomas had thrown himself into work, using professional success to process his grief. His social circle had narrowed as he focused on his career. And while we had remained close, there had always been a distance, his guilt over being absent during much of his father's illness, his discomfort with my simpler lifestyle as his own tastes grew more expensive. "Thomas lost his father 12 years ago," I said softly. "It was difficult for him. I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Sullivan, for everything." Rebecca sounded genuinely remorseful. "I should have spoken up sooner." "You're speaking now," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "That's what matters." After arranging to stay in contact, I hung up and turned to face a bewildered Beatrice. In quick, concise sentences, I explained what I'd learned. "My God," Beatrice breathed when I finished. "What are you going to do?" I glanced at the clock again. Nearly 10:01 now. "Check my email first, then decide." My ancient desktop computer took what felt like eternity to boot up. When I finally accessed my email, Rebecca's message waited with multiple attachments. Beatrice and I huddled together, scanning through damning text messages, financial documents, and photographs of properties that had indeed been sold to finance. Weddings that never happened. Most disturbing was the audio file, Vanessa's voice, slurred but unmistakable, laughing about her manipulation of Thomas and her plans for my house proceeds. The casual cruelty with which she discussed my son, referring to him as easily managed and conveniently estranged from Mommy, made my stomach turn. "We need to get this to Thomas," Beatrice said urgently. "Right now, before he makes the biggest mistake of his life." I nodded, gathering the pages I'd hastily printed. "But he won't take my calls. He's blocked my number." Beatrice considered this for a moment. "What about his best man? Andrew, isn't it? The one who went to college with him?" "Andy," I corrected, hope flickering. "They've been friends since freshman year. Thomas hasn't spoken much about him lately, but Vanessa wouldn't have been able to completely isolate Thomas from his oldest friend," Beatrice finished. "Not someone in the wedding party. Do you have his number?" I did, somewhere in my address book. After a frantic search, I found it and dialed with trembling fingers, praying he hadn't changed numbers in the years since I'd last contacted him. The call went to voicemail. I left a brief, urgent message asking him to call me back immediately about Thomas. Then, running out of options and time, I made a decision. "We're going to the wedding," I said firmly, gathering the printed evidence into a folder. "Not as guests, but to stop it." Beatrice looked skeptical. "They'll never let you near him. You said the venue has security." "Then we'll find another way," I insisted, a mother's determination overriding all other considerations. "I will not let that woman destroy my son." As we hurried to the car, the gravity of what we were attempting hit me fully. I was about to possibly humiliate my son on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Even with evidence, he might not believe me. He might hate me forever for interfering. But the alternative, standing by while he married a woman who saw him as nothing more than a financial resource to be exploited, was unthinkable. "James always said I was too protective," I murmured, as Beatrice navigated morning traffic at decidedly above legal speeds. "That I needed to let Thomas make his own mistakes." "There's mistakes, and then there's catastrophes," Beatrice replied, grimly. "This falls firmly in the latter category." Oakridge Estate appeared ahead, its manicured grounds and elegant facade a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil we carried with us. Luxury cars filled the parking area, guests in formal attire already making their way toward the garden where the ceremony would take place. My heart sank as I spotted a uniformed security guard checking invitations at the entrance. Beatrice parked at the far end of the lot, and we sat for a moment, formulating a plan. "The service entrance," I finally suggested. "From my nursing days, there's always a back way in for deliveries and staff." Beatrice nodded approvingly. "Now, you're thinking like the Ellie I trained with in the ER. Let's go." We made our way around the perimeter of the property, trying to look purposeful rather than suspicious in our formal wear. Behind the main building, we found what we were seeking, a utilitarian entrance where catering staff bustled in and out, carrying trays and equipment. "Follow my lead," Beatrice whispered, smoothing her dress and adopting the imperious expression she'd perfected during decades of managing hospital departments. She approached a harried-looking young man in catering attire. "Excuse me, we're looking for the groom's suite immediately. Ms. Bradford sent us with an urgent message for Mr. Sullivan." The young man barely glanced at us, too busy balancing about a tray of champagne flutes. "Second floor, east wing, but they're moving to the ceremony site in like 5 minutes, so hurry." We slipped inside, navigating the controlled chaos of a high-end wedding in its final preparation stages. Following signs, we located the stairs and ascended quickly, the folder of evidence clutched tightly in my hands. The hallway on the second floor was quiet compared to the activity below, the thick carpet muffling our footsteps as we searched for the east wing. A burst of male laughter guided us to a door marked Groom's Suite. I hesitated, suddenly paralyzed by doubt. What if he doesn't believe me? I whispered to Beatrice. What if this only pushes him further away? Beatrice squeezed my hand reassuringly. That's a risk we have to take. Truth is still truth, Ellie, even when it's painful. Especially when it's painful. I took a deep breath and knocked firmly on the door. The door swung open to reveal Andy, handsome in his tuxedo, but looking somehow diminished from the exuberant young man who used to spend holidays at our dinner table. His eyes widened in shock at the sight of me. "Mrs. Sullivan?" he gasped, stepping into the hallway and pulling the door nearly closed behind him. "What are you doing here?" "Thomas said you weren't—" "Andy, please," I interrupted, desperation making my voice quiver. "I need to speak with my son immediately. It's urgent." He glanced nervously over his shoulder. "This isn't a good time. We're heading down for the ceremony in a few minutes, and Thomas is already stressed about—" "It's about Vanessa," I said bluntly. "She's not who he thinks she is. I have evidence he needs to see before he makes a terrible mistake." Something flickered across Andy's face, a shadow of doubt that told me he might not be entirely surprised by my words. "Andy?" Thomas's voice called from within. "Who's at the door?" Before Andy could respond, the door pulled fully open and my son stood before me. The sight of him, so handsome in his tuxedo, so like his father, nearly took my breath away. For a moment, he simply stared, disbelief etched across his features. "Mom?" The word emerged half-whispered, as if he might be hallucinating. Then his expression hardened. "What are you doing here? I made it clear you weren't welcome." The coldness in his voice cut deep, but Rebecca's revelations gave me courage. "Thomas, please. Just 5 minutes. There's something you need to know before the ceremony." "I don't need to know anything except that you've chosen your house over my happiness," he snapped. "I can't believe you'd show up here to cause a scene on my wedding day." "I'm not here to cause a scene," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I'm here because I love you too much to stay silent." Beatrice stepped forward. "Thomas, your mother received some very disturbing information this morning. Information about Vanessa that you need to hear." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "So, you brought reinforcements to ambush me? This is exactly why I didn't want you here. You've never given Vanessa a fair chance. You've been against her from the beginning because she sees through your manipulative—" "Thomas." "James Sullivan," I interrupted, my mother's tone cutting through his tirade. "I have never lied to you, and I'm not starting now. Please, 5 minutes. If you still want to go through with the wedding afterward, I'll leave quietly. You'll never have to see me again." Something in my words, perhaps the painful sincerity of that final promise, gave him pause. He glanced at his watch, then at Andy, who gave a small nod. 5 minutes, Thomas conceded icily. "In here." He gestured to a small sitting room across the hall, separate from the groomsmen gathered in the suite. Once inside with the door closed, I wasted no time. "Vanessa has been engaged 3 times before," I began, opening the folder of evidence. Each time, she targeted men whose parents had significant assets but limited cash flow. Each time, she manipulated the situation to pressure the parents into liquidating property or taking out loans to finance extravagant weddings. And each time, she broke off the engagement just before the ceremony, but not before securing access to joint accounts and assets. Thomas stared at me as if I'd started speaking in tongues. That's ridiculous. That's completely insane. I wish it were, I said softly, handing him the printouts Rebecca had sent. These are text messages between Vanessa and her former roommate, Rebecca. This one specifically mentions targeting your mother's cute little house as far back as your third date. His hands shook slightly as he scanned the messages, disbelief warring with the evidence before him. These could be fake. Anyone could create screenshots. Listen to this then, Beatrice said, producing my phone and playing the recording of Vanessa's drunken call from the previous night. Vanessa's distinctive voice filled the small room. Another sentimental old bat who'll probably die alone in a nursing home while I enjoy her liquidated equity. Thomas is even easier to manage than Daniel was, so desperate for approval, so conveniently estranged from Mommy. The color drained from Thomas's face as the recording continued, Vanessa laughingly describing how she planned to access his accounts after the wedding, how she needed the money from my house to cover a few financial hiccups her fiancé knew nothing about. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was absolute. Thomas sat heavily on a small settee, the papers trembling in his hands. "There's more," I said gently. "Financial records showing she was fired from her firm 3 months ago for falsifying client billings. Credit card statements showing over $200,000 in debt. Documentation of the previous weddings that never happened, and the properties her former fiancé's parents sold to finance them." Thomas stared at the evidence, his expression shifting from disbelief to confusion to a dawning horror that broke my heart to witness. "She said she was promoted," he murmured, almost to himself. "She's been going to work every day. She shows me emails from her clients." His voice trailed off as he reached the falsified employment records. "She's been lying to you, sweetheart," I said softly, using the endearment I hadn't dared speak in months. About her job, about her past, about her intentions. Thomas looked up at me, and in that moment, I saw my little boy again. Vulnerable, hurt, needing his mother's comfort. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why me?" I sat beside him, careful not to touch him yet, sensing he was too fragile for physical comfort. "Rebecca says Vanessa researches potential targets carefully. Men who are professionally successful but not independently wealthy. Men close to their parents, especially if those parents own property outright. Men who might be socially insecure, in some way, eager to please and impress. And men with some estrangement from a parent," Beatrice added gently, creating a vulnerability she could exploit. Thomas flinched at that, his gaze dropping to his hands. "After Dad died," he said quietly, "I threw myself into work, into building something that would make him proud. Make you proud." "Oh, Thomas," I breathed, my heart breaking. "Your father was already proud of you. So am I. Not for what you've achieved professionally, but for who you are." "Who am I?" he asked bitterly, gesturing to his tuxedo, the opulent surroundings. "Someone who was ready to cut his mother out of his life for a woman who saw him as nothing but a meal ticket. Someone so desperate for status that he couldn't see what was right in front of him." "You're human," I said firmly. "We all make mistakes. We all want to be loved, to belong." Vanessa exploited that very human need. A sharp knock at the door interrupted us. Andy poked his head in, his expression tense. "Thomas? Everyone's waiting. The officiant says we need to start in 5 minutes or we'll lose our time slot for the garden ceremony." Thomas stared at the documentation in his lap, then at me, indecision written across his features. "What do I do?" he asked, sounding younger than I'd heard him in years. "There are 200 people out there. Vanessa's family, my colleagues, everyone we know." "You have options," Beatrice said practically. "You can postpone, citing an emergency. You can go through with it knowing what you know and deal with the aftermath later. Or you can end it now." Thomas ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, disrupting it in a way that reminded me powerfully of his father. "If I postpone or go through with it, I'm just prolonging the inevitable, aren't I? Once I know this, I can't unknow it." "No," I agreed softly. "You can't." Another knock, more insistent this time. "Thomas!" It was Vanessa's father, his authoritative voice unmistakable even through the door. "What's the holdup? Vanessa is ready to process in." Thomas took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders in a gesture so like James that tears pricked my eyes. "I need to see her," he said, standing up. "I need to look her in the eyes when I ask her about this." "Is that wise?" Beatrice asked, concern furrowing her brow. "She might try to talk her way out of it, manipulate the situation." Thomas gathered the evidence, folding it carefully and tucking it into his jacket pocket. "Maybe, but I need to do this my way." He turned to me, his expression a complex mixture of pain, gratitude, and resolve. "Thank you for coming today, for not giving up on me even when I gave up on you." Before I could respond, he opened the door and strode into the hallway, brushing past Vanessa's startled father without explanation. Andy gave me a quick, encouraging nod before following, leaving Beatrice and me alone in the sitting room. "Well," Beatrice said after a moment, "that didn't go quite how I expected." "No," I agreed, my heart racing. "But he heard us. He believed us. That's more than I dared hope for." "What now?" Beatrice asked. I glanced at my watch, 10:58. "Now we wait. And pray he finds the strength to do what needs to be done." We made our way downstairs, avoiding the main areas where guests were gathered. Through a window, I could see the garden ceremony site, rows of white chairs adorned with lavish floral arrangements, a flower-covered arch where vows would be exchanged, musicians poised with their instruments. So much expense, so much spectacle, all built on a foundation of lies. The sound of raised voices drew our attention to a side corridor. Thomas and Vanessa stood facing each other in what appeared to be a small antechamber, its door ajar. She was resplendent in a designer gown that must have cost more than my annual pension, her expression a mixture of confusion and increasing alarm as Thomas spoke. His back to us. Beatrice and I couldn't hear the words, but we could see Vanessa's face transform. First disbelief, then defensive anger, then a calculating calm that sent a chill down my spine even from a distance. She reached for Thomas, her hand on his arm, her expression softening into something that seemed like genuine distress. I could see her mouth forming words that looked like denials, explanations, perhaps even accusations against me. Thomas shook his head, removing her hand from his arm, then reached into his pocket and withdrew the papers. Vanessa's composure faltered as he handed them to her one by one. Even from our vantage point, I could see the moment when understanding dawned, the realization that her scheme had been exposed, that this target would not be as easily manipulated as the others. Her transformation was startling. The beautiful, controlled woman who had looked down on my modest home and simple life vanished, replaced by someone whose face contorted with fury. She snatched at the papers in Thomas's hands, ripping several before he could step back. Her voice rose, now, audible even to us. "You ungrateful, pathetic little man! Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? Who do you think would want you without me? You're nothing but a small-time architect from nowhere, with your shabby little firm and your sad little dreams." Thomas stood still, absorbing the verbal assault with a calmness that spoke of newfound clarity. When she paused for breath, his response was too quiet for us to hear, but its effect on Vanessa was electric. Whatever he said made her recoil, as if slapped, for A moment. They stood in tableau, Thomas straight-backed and resolute, Vanessa trembling with thwarted rage. Then she did something I would never have expected from the polished, controlled woman I thought I knew. She picked up a crystal vase from a nearby table and hurled it at the wall beside Thomas's head. The crash brought several wedding staff running. Vanessa stormed past them, shoving aside a concerned-looking woman in a coordinator's headset. She disappeared down the corridor, the train of her designer gown sweeping behind her like a vengeful cloud. Thomas remained in the antechamber, his back still to us, his shoulders slightly slumped as if a great weight had been lifted but had left bruises in its wake. After a moment, Andy appeared at his side, saying something that made Thomas nod in agreement. "Should we go to him?" Beatrice whispered, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. I shook my head. "Not yet. He needs a minute." Andy guided Thomas toward another door, presumably to give him privacy from the growing number of staff and curious guests drawn by the commotion. I glimpsed my son's profile as he turned, ashen but composed, his jaw set in the same determined expression James had worn when facing difficult truths. "What happens now?" Beatrice asked as we watched them disappear from view. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it is, I'll be here for him, if he wants me to be." Before Beatrice could respond, Vanessa's father appeared at the end of the corridor, his face thunderous as he surveyed the broken glass and confused staff. His eyes landed on me, narrowing in recognition and immediate hostility. "You," he said, advancing toward us with barely contained fury. "This is your doing. You couldn't stand to see your son happy, could you? Had to poison him against Vanessa because you're jealous of her youth, her success, her place in his life." I straightened my spine, meeting his gaze steadily. "Mr. Bradford, I understand you're upset, but perhaps you should speak with your daughter before making accusations. My daughter is in tears because your son just called off the wedding minutes before the ceremony," he shouted, his face reddening dangerously. "Do you have any idea of the humiliation, the expense? We have 200 guests out there." "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," I replied, keeping my voice deliberately calm. "But I'm more concerned about the fact that your daughter has a pattern of targeting men for financial gain, breaking off engagements after families have liquidated assets, and walking away with substantial sums that were never returned." My direct statement stopped him cold. His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something, knowledge, concern, crossing his features before hardening again into indignation. "That's preposterous. That's defamation. I could sue you for—" "You could," Beatrice interjected smoothly. "But then all the evidence would become part of the public record. The recordings, the text messages, the documentation of previous engagements and financial transactions. Is that really a risk you want to take, Mr. Bradford?" The implication hung in the air between us. After a long moment, he stepped back, straightening his tie in a gesture that seemed designed to buy time rather than adjust his appearance. "I don't know what game you're playing," he said, his voice now controlled, almost diplomatic. "But this isn't over. Vanessa and Thomas have just had a misunderstanding. Every couple argues before the wedding. It's normal pre-ceremony jitters." His attempt to minimize what had just occurred would have been almost comical if it weren't so desperately sad. I wondered how many times he had made similar excuses for his daughter, how many warning signs he had ignored or justified away. "Mr. Bradford," I said gently, "I think we both know this is more than jitters. Your daughter needs help, not enablement. And my son deserves the truth." Before he could respond, Andy reappeared at the end of the corridor, scanning the area until he spotted me. He hurried over, pointedly ignoring Mr. Bradford. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, slightly out of breath. "Thomas is asking for you. He's in the library on the east side of the building." He glanced at the broken glass, the hovering staff, Mr. Bradford's thunderous expression. It's been quite a morning." "Thank you, Andy," I said, reaching out to squeeze his arm gratefully. For everything. As Beatrice and I followed Andy toward the library, leaving Mr. Bradford surrounded by the wreckage of his daughter's latest scheme, I felt a curious mixture of sorrow and relief. The wedding that had consumed my thoughts for months was now definitively canceled, but at what cost to my son's heart and pride? Thomas had avoided a disastrous marriage, but now faced the humiliation of explaining to 200 guests why there would be no ceremony. Yet beneath these concerns ran a current of cautious hope. Thomas had asked for me. After months of silence and rejection, my son wanted his mother by his side as he navigated the aftermath of betrayal. It was a beginning, tenuous, fragile, but real. Outside the library door, I paused, gathering my courage. Whatever lay ahead, uncomfortable explanations to guests, potential confrontations with Vanessa's family, the long process of Thomas rebuilding his trust in others and in himself. We would face it together. Ready? Beatrice asked softly. I nodded, straightening the pearl necklace she had loaned me just hours earlier, in another lifetime when I had planned only to witness my son's wedding from a distance. Ready, I confirmed, and opened the door to whatever came next. The library at Oakridge Estate was a sanctuary of quiet elegance, walls lined with leather-bound books, deep leather chairs, and tall windows that bathed the room in natural light. Thomas stood with his back to one of these windows, his silhouette framed against the bright spring day outside. He had removed his bow tie and jacket, and somehow this small dishevelment made him look more like himself than he had in months. When he turned at the sound of the door opening, I saw the evidence of tears on his face. Without thinking, I opened my arms, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides to embrace me. For a moment, we simply held each other, the first physical contact we'd had since the argument that had severed our relationship 6 months ago. I'm so sorry, Mom, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I said terrible things to you. Unforgivable things. There's nothing my son could do that I wouldn't forgive, I replied, stroking his hair as I had when he was a little boy frightened by thunderstorms. Nothing. He pulled back, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand in a gesture so reminiscent of his childhood that my heart constricted. How did you know? About Vanessa? I explained about Rebecca's call, watching Thomas's expression shift between disbelief, anger, and painful acceptance as I recounted the details of Vanessa's past schemes. 200 people, he said finally, shaking his head in dismay. 200 people out there waiting for a wedding that's not going to happen. Colleagues, clients, friends. They'll understand, Beatrice offered from where she'd settled quietly in one of the library chairs. Better an uncomfortable explanation than a disastrous marriage. Thomas managed a weak smile. Voice of reason as always, Bea. Someone has to be with you Sullivans and your dramatic tendencies, she replied affectionately. Andy knocked and entered with a tray bearing a silver coffee service. Thought we could all use this, he said, setting it down on a mahogany side table. Figured it'd be better than the champagne they keep trying to bring in. As he poured, a flurry of activity in the corridor outside caught our attention. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, the squawk of walkie-talkies. The wedding coordinator appeared at the door, her professional composure notably strained. Mr. Sullivan, she began hesitantly. I don't mean to intrude, but the situation is becoming somewhat difficult to manage. Ms. Bradford has, well, she's rather dramatically departed the premises in the bridal car. Her parents are speaking with guests, suggesting there's been a postponement due to a medical emergency concerning you. She paused delicately. Is that the narrative you'd prefer us to support? Thomas stared at her blankly. Medical emergency? Mr. Bradford is saying you suffered a panic attack, Andy explained, his expression caught between concern and amusement. Apparently, you're now sedated and resting, and the wedding will be rescheduled. That's absurd, Thomas said, straightening, indignantly. I'm clearly not sedated or having a medical crisis. It's a face-saving fiction, I suggested gently. For them as much as for you. He considered this, then shook his head decisively. No, I won't start the next chapter of my life with a lie, however convenient. He turned to the coordinator. Please tell the guests that I deeply apologize for the inconvenience, but the wedding has been canceled. Not postponed, canceled. They're welcome to stay for the meal if they wish. It's already paid for. I'll make a brief statement in... He glanced at his watch. 15 minutes, in the main hall. The coordinator nodded, clearly relieved to have clear directions. Very good, sir. I'll arrange it immediately. After she left, Thomas sank into a chair, cradling his coffee cup as if it might anchor him. I don't even know what to say to them. Truth, I said simply. Not all the painful details, but the essential truth. That you've learned things about your relationship that make marriage impossible. He nodded slowly. And afterward? What then? I can't go back to my apartment. Vanessa has a key, and half her belongings are there. You'll come home with me, I said without hesitation. For as long as you need. Home, he repeated, a world of meaning in the single syllable. I wasn't sure I still had one, after everything I said. You will always have a home with me, Thomas. Always. The next 15 minutes passed in quiet preparation. Thomas drafted brief remarks on the library stationery while I helped him restore some order to his appearance, straightening his collar, and smoothing his hair as I had done before countless school pictures and job interviews. Andy left to find the rest of the groomsmen and explain the situation. Beatrice stepped out to call a locksmith friend who agreed to meet us at Thomas's apartment later to change the locks, a precaution that seemed prudent given Vanessa's volatile reaction. When it was time, Thomas squared his shoulders and led us from the library to the main hall where the reception would have been held. The space was filled with confused guests in formal attire, their murmured conversations creating a nervous hum that fell silent as Thomas appeared. He walked to the center of the room, his posture straight and dignified despite the obvious strain in his face. I remained at the back with Beatrice, proud beyond words of my son's courage. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, Thomas began, his architect's voice carrying clearly through the hushed space. I want to first thank you all for coming today, and then apologize sincerely for the unprecedented situation. There will be no wedding ceremony today. After receiving important information this morning, I've made the difficult but necessary decision to end my relationship with Vanessa. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Thomas raised a hand to quiet it. I won't be sharing the specific details out of respect for privacy, both mine and Vanessa's. What I will say is that I discovered fundamental incompatibilities and breaches of trust that make a marriage between us impossible. He paused, drawing a deep breath. The staff will be serving the reception meal for anyone who wishes to stay. Please consider it my appreciation for your understanding during this awkward situation. For those who prefer to leave, I completely understand and apologize again for the inconvenience. He finished with remarkable composure, though I could see the cost in the tightness around his eyes. As he stepped back, a ripple of supportive applause spread through the room. Initiated, I noticed with a surge of gratitude, by Andy and the other groomsmen. Several guests approached Thomas with handshakes and supportive words, while others discreetly made their exits. Vanessa's parents were notably absent, having apparently departed with or shortly after their daughter. It was nearly 2 hours later, when we finally left Oakridge Estate. Thomas had insisted on personally thanking the staff and vendors who had managed the chaotic situation with professionalism. He had spoken briefly with each departing guest, accepted their well wishes with grace, and endured their curiosity with dignity. By the time we reached the parking lot, exhaustion was evident in every line of his body. He slid into the back seat of Beatrice's car without protest, leaning his head against the window as we drove away from what should have been the venue of his wedding day. "Are you holding up all right?" I asked softly, reaching across to touch his hand. He nodded without opening his eyes. Just tired. And he hesitated. Embarrassed? Ashamed? I was so completely fooled. Vanessa is practiced at deception, reminded him. And she targeted you specifically because of qualities that are actually virtues. Your generosity, your desire to care for others, your capacity for love and trust. I wasn't very generous or loving to you, he said, finally looking at me. I chose her over you without hesitation. I threatened to cut you out of my life if you didn't sell your home. Who does that to their mother? Someone who was being masterfully manipulated, Beatrice interjected from the driver's seat. I've seen it before with my patients, Thomas. Predatory people isolate their targets from anyone who might see through the facade. They create false choices, us versus them scenarios. It's not your fault. It feels like my fault, he said quietly. I should have seen through it. Should have questioned why she was so fixated on your house, Mom. Should have noticed how she subtly undermined my relationship with you from the beginning. Hindsight offers clarity none of us have in the moment, I said. What matters now is moving forward. The remainder of the drive passed in contemplative silence. As familiar streets replaced the highway, I felt Thomas relax slightly beside me. When we turned onto Maple Street, he sat up straighter, looking at the neighborhood with new eyes, or perhaps with old ones, rediscovering the quiet beauty of the street where he had grown up. Mrs. Peterson was in her front yard as we pulled into my driveway. She waved, then did a double-take at the sight of Thomas emerging from the car in his wedding attire minus jacket and tie. Isn't today? She began, confusion evident in her voice. A very long story for another time, Helen, Beatrice called cheerfully. Thomas will be staying with Eleanor for a while. Perhaps you could bring over some of that excellent banana bread tomorrow? Mrs. Peterson, bless her heart, picked up on Dao. The cue immediately. Of course, I'd be delighted. Welcome home, Thomas. We've missed seeing you around here. Inside the house, Thomas stood in the entryway, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. His gaze lingered on the height markings on the kitchen doorframe, the family photos on the wall, the slightly crooked bookshelf he and his father had built together. It's exactly the same, he murmured. After everything that's happened, after how horribly I behaved, you didn't change a thing. Why would I asked simply. This is our home. Your father's and mine and yours too. Always. He disappeared upstairs to change out of his wedding clothes and shower away the emotional residue of the day. Beatrice helped me prepare a simple meal, comfort food from Thomas's childhood, chicken and dumplings that had been his favorite since he could eat solid foods. You're a remarkable woman, Eleanor Sullivan, Beatrice said as she chopped carrots at the kitchen counter. After everything he said to you, how he treated you, here you are, making his favorite meal and welcoming him back without condition. That's what mothers do, I replied, though the compliment warmed me. Love doesn't keep score. Still, she insisted. Many people would hold at least a little grudge, demand at least a formal apology. I shrugged, rolling out dough for the dumplings. What would be the point? He's hurting enough already. Besides, he did apologize, and I believe him. The rest will come with time. Later that evening, after Beatrice had gone home and Thomas and I had shared a quiet meal, we sat together on the back porch swing. The garden was peaceful in the twilight, the azaleas luminous in the fading light. For a long while, we simply rocked in companionable silence, the rhythmic creaking of the chains a soothing counterpoint to the day's chaos. I spoke to Rebecca, Thomas said finally. While you were setting the table, she called to check if I was all right. That was thoughtful of her. He nodded. She said Vanessa's done this before, not just the engagements and financial schemes, but the vicious character assassination afterward. Apparently, her previous fiancés were subjected to rumors about infidelity, mental instability, even criminal behavior. Are you worried she'll try that with you? I asked, concerned. Let her try, he said with unexpected steel in his voice. I have the evidence Rebecca provided, plus documentation of her financial deceptions, and unlike her previous targets, I have no intention of slinking away in embarrassed silence. I studied my son in the gathering darkness, noting the determination in his profile. Perhaps Vanessa had inadvertently given him something valuable, a newfound strength, a clearer understanding of his own boundaries and worth. Your father would be proud of how you handled today, I said softly. Standing up in front of all those people and taking responsibility when you could have hidden behind a convenient lie. Thomas was quiet for so long, I thought he might not respond. When he did, his voice was thick with emotion. I found Dad's journal in my jacket pocket when I changed. I don't remember putting it there. I smiled in the darkness. I may have slipped it in this morning before everything happened. I thought you might need his wisdom today, whatever occurred at the wedding. I did, Thomas admitted. I read his last entry while you were cooking. The one where he worried about my ambition, about whether I'd recognize what truly matters in life. He reached for my hand in the darkness. I think I'm finally starting to understand what he meant, what you both tried to teach me. And what's that? I asked, squeezing his fingers gently. That a life built on appearances is no life at all. That true wealth isn't measured in square footage or status symbols, but in relationships that sustain you. He glanced around at the modest garden, the small porch, the humble home behind us. In having somewhere and someone to come home to when everything falls apart. I blinked back tears, resting my head against his shoulder as we continued to rock gently in the darkness. The future remained uncertain. Thomas would need to rebuild his life, reclaim his apartment, possibly face professional and social fallout from the canceled wedding. There would be difficult days ahead. But here, in this moment, we had already found something precious in the wreckage of what might have been. A second chance at the relationship Vanessa had nearly destroyed. A journey home for a son who had lost his way. The phone call that had changed everything this morning had done more than save Thomas from a disastrous marriage. It had restored a mother and son to each other, a reunion far more meaningful than any wedding could have been. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I made a silent promise to myself and to James's memory. This time, I would make sure Thomas understood his true inheritance. Not a house to be sold or equity to be liquidated, but the enduring legacy of being loved unconditionally, exactly as he was. That was a wealth no one could ever manipulate, exploit, or take away. The peaceful sanctuary Thomas and I found that evening on the porch swing proved to be merely the eye of the storm. The week that followed brought a whirlwind of complications, confrontations, and unexpected revelations that tested our newly restored relationship. The first challenge came the following morning. Thomas had just come downstairs, drawn by the aroma of pancakes, another childhood comfort, when his phone rang. The screen displayed his law firm's name, and his face tightened with apprehension. "Hello?" he answered, his professional voice settling into place despite his obvious tension. I busied myself at the stove, trying to give him privacy while remaining close enough to offer support if needed. The one-sided conversation I overheard was troubling. "Yes, I understand. Of course it's unexpected. No, I don't think that's fair at all. I see. May I at least come in to discuss this in person? I appreciate that, Gerald. Thank you." When he hung up, Thomas stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen, his expression shell-shocked. "What happened?" I asked gently, turning off the burner and moving to his side. That was Gerald Hoffman, the senior partner. Thomas's voice sounded distant, detached. Vanessa's father called him last night. Apparently, the Bradford family is one of the firm's most significant clients, something Vanessa never mentioned to me. My stomach tightened with foreboding. What did they say? They're requesting that I take a leave of absence until, and I quote, this unfortunate personal situation resolves itself. The bitterness in his laugh held no humor. In other words, I'm being sidelined until the Bradfords decide whether they're pulling their business. I guided him to a chair, setting a mug of coffee before him. Can they do that? It seems deeply unfair. They can do whatever they want, Thomas said, staring into the coffee as if it might contain answers. I'm not being fired, not yet anyway, but I'm effectively being put on ice. My current clients will be reassigned to other associates. Because you refused to marry a woman who lied to you? That's absurd. Thomas took a sip of coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. Office politics rarely align with fairness, Mom, especially when millions in client billings are at stake. Watching his shoulders slump under this new blow, my protective instincts surged. You need legal advice of your own. This feels like retaliation. From a legal perspective, they're within their rights, but Gerald at least agreed to meet with me tomorrow. He attempted a weak smile. Maybe I can salvage something from the professional wreckage Vanessa's left behind. That afternoon, while Thomas went to his apartment with Andy and the locksmith to secure his home and retrieve essential belongings, I received an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang just after 2 o'clock, revealing a slender woman in her early 30s. Her auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her expression nervously determined. Mrs. Sullivan? I'm Rebecca Martin. She extended her hand tentatively. I hope it's okay that I came by. I wanted to check how Thomas is doing, and to apologize to you in person. I invited her inside, studying the woman whose phone call had changed everything. In person, Rebecca projected a quiet competence tinged with obvious regret. As we settled in the living room with tea, she seemed unable to meet my eyes directly. I should have come forward sooner, she began, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her teacup. Long before things reached this point, if I'd spoken up months ago, Thomas might have been spared such public humiliation. You spoke up when it mattered most, I assured her. That took courage. Rebecca shook her head. Not courage, belated conscience. I was complicit in Vanessa's schemes for too long, making excuses, looking the other way. By the time I realized how destructive she truly was, she already had leverage over me, professional and personal. As Rebecca shared more about her history with Vanessa, a disturbing pattern emerged. Vanessa Bradford was more calculating than even the evidence had suggested. She cultivated relationships with people she could use, maintained extensive documentation on potential targets and their families, and employed a network of associates, like Rebecca had once been, to help execute her schemes. It's not just the financial aspect, Rebecca explained. Vanessa enjoys the control, the manipulation. Breaking apart family bonds gives her a particular satisfaction. She sees love and loyalty as weaknesses to exploit, not strengths to respect. How did you break free of her influence? I asked. Rebecca's expression darkened. Her previous fiancé, Daniel, after she engineered their breakup, he attempted suicide. I was the one who found him. She swallowed hard. Somehow that was my wake-up call. I realized I couldn't participate in destroying people's lives anymore, not even passively. The revelation hung heavy between us. Thomas had narrowly escaped, not just financial exploitation, but potentially devastating emotional trauma. Have you spoken with the other families? Michael's and Daniel's? I asked. Rebecca nodded. I've been trying to make amends. Michael has rebuilt his life, though his parents had to sell their cabin to cover debts. Daniel? She hesitated. Daniel is still struggling. The shame was overwhelming for him. He moved back in with his mother, rarely leaves the house. Before we could continue, the front door opened and Thomas appeared with several suitcases. His eyes widened at the sight of Rebecca in our living room. Rebecca? What are you doing here? She stood awkwardly. I wanted to see how you were holding up. And to warn you, Vanessa isn't likely to simply walk away. Based on her patterns, she'll try to retaliate somehow. Thomas set down his bags with a weary sigh. She already has. I'm effectively suspended from my firm because of her father's influence. That's just the beginning, Rebecca said grimly. Check your social media, your email. She'll be working to control the narrative. Thomas pulled out his phone, frowning as he scrolled through notifications. His face paled visibly. She's posted on every platform. Says I had a mental breakdown at the wedding, that she's praying for my recovery and supporting me during this difficult time. He continued reading, his expression hardening. She strongly implies I've been struggling with substance abuse issues that I kept hidden from her. Classic Vanessa, Rebecca said. She's positioning herself as the concerned, supportive partner while simultaneously destroying your reputation. There's more, Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Emails to my colleagues, clients, even old college friends, all expressing her deep concern about my increasingly erratic behavior leading up to the wedding. I moved to his side, reading over his shoulder. The messages were masterfully crafted, superficially compassionate while planting devastating seeds of doubt about Thomas's mental stability and professional competence. She's trying to ensure that when you tell the truth about why you called off the wedding, no one will believe you, Rebecca explained. She's undermining your credibility before you can damage hers. Thomas sank onto the couch, overwhelmed by this new assault. How do I fight this? If I defend myself, I look defensive and unstable. If I say nothing, her narrative becomes reality. Rebecca sat beside him, her expression serious but determined. You fight it with the truth, documentation, witnesses, the same evidence that convinced you of her deception. She paused. And you're not alone. I've been in contact with Michael and Daniel. They're willing to come forward now to corroborate the pattern, the possibility of allies, other victims who understood exactly what Thomas was experiencing, visibly strengthened his resolve. We need a strategy, he said, a spark of his professional confidence returning. Careful, measured responses, legal, considerations, damage control. As they began discussing options, I slipped into the kitchen to give them space. Through the doorway, I watched my son, less than 48 hours removed from his canceled wedding, already finding the strength to face this new challenge. His posture had straightened, his voice grown more assured as he and Rebecca outlined potential approaches. The doorbell rang again, interrupting their planning session. When I opened it, Andy stood on the porch with several more of Thomas's belongings and a troubled expression. Mrs. Sullivan, you need to see this, he said, handing me a local newspaper. The society page featured a large photograph of Thomas and Vanessa from their engagement party, beneath a headline that made my blood run cold. Architects melt down. Derail society wedding. Family concerns about mental health. It's in the online edition too, Andy said grimly. Comments are already flooding in, people claiming they always noticed something off about Thomas, others expressing sympathy for Vanessa. I carried the newspaper to Thomas, whose face hardened as he read the article. It was clearly sourced exclusively from the Bradford family, portraying Thomas as unstable and Vanessa as the supportive fiancée blindsided by his breakdown. Your firm's managing partner is quoted, I noted, pointing to a paragraph where Gerald Hoffman expressed support during this difficult time and mentioned Thomas's leave of absence to focus on health concerns. The article concluded with a statement supposedly from Thomas himself, words he had never spoken, expressing regret for any embarrassment caused to the Bradford family and asking for privacy during this challenging personal time. They're quoting me without my authorization, Thomas said incredulously. That's libel. I never said any of this. Rebecca's expression was grim, but not surprised. Vanessa likely convinced the reporter she had your permission. She's done this before, spoken for her ex-fiancés in the press, controlled the public narrative. Thomas stood up, pacing the living room with renewed energy. This ends now. I won't be painted as mentally unstable or substance addicted to protect Vanessa's reputation. What are you going to do? I asked, both concerned and proud of his determination. He turned to Rebecca. You said Michael and Daniel would be willing to come forward to share their experiences? She nodded. They're ready. They've been waiting for someone who would stand up to her publicly. Then we counter with the truth. Not just my truth, our collective truth. His eyes held a steel I hadn't seen since James was alive. No more victims staying silent out of shame while she targets someone new. As evening approached, our modest living room transformed into an impromptu war room. Andy brought his laptop and media connections from his PR job. Beatrice arrived with dinner and her practical perspective. Rebecca coordinated video calls with Michael and Daniel, who joined our planning session remotely. Two men whose lives had been upended by the same woman who had nearly destroyed Thomas's. Watching these strangers unite around my son, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for their support, rage at what Vanessa had done to all of them, and profound pride in Thomas's refusal to be silenced or shamed. When the planning finally wound down after midnight, our kitchen table was covered with notes, timelines, and strategy documents. Thomas had drafted a public statement with Andy's help, scheduled meetings with his firm's partners, and coordinated with Michael and Daniel to release simultaneous accounts of Vanessa's pattern of behavior. It's going to get worse before it gets better, Rebecca warned as everyone prepared to leave. Vanessa will escalate when she realizes you're fighting back. Thomas nodded, exhaustion evident in his face but determination undiminished. Let her. I'm done being manipulated, by her or by fear of what people might think. After our guests departed and we were alone again, Thomas helped me clear away the dinner dishes, moving through the familiar kitchen with the ease of muscle memory. I'm sorry this has all landed in your home, he said quietly. I never meant to bring such chaos into your life. I rinsed a plate, choosing my words carefully. Do you remember what your father always said about storms? A faint smile touched Thomas's lips. That it's not about avoiding them, but about having a safe harbor to return to when they hit. Exactly. I squeezed his hand, still damp from the dishwater. That's what home is, Thomas. Not just a building, though I'm certainly glad I didn't sell it now, but a place where you're loved unconditionally, especially during the storms. Later, as I prepared for bed, I heard Thomas in the guest room, now his temporary room, speaking quietly on the phone. His voice drifted through the hallway, resolute and clear. I understand your concerns, Gerald, but I won't participate in a fiction about my mental health to protect Vanessa Bradford's reputation or her family's business. No, I'm not being vindictive. Yes, I have documentation of everything I'm alleging. I appreciate the firm's difficult position, but my professional reputation is at stake. I'll see you tomorrow at 9. As his call ended, I silently thanked Rebecca for her courage in making that fateful phone call on the wedding day. Without her intervention, Thomas might now be married to a woman who saw him as nothing more than a means to an end, another conquest in a pattern of calculated exploitation. TT. Road ahead would be difficult. Vanessa's smear campaign was gaining traction. The Bradford family's influence extended through social and professional circles Thomas relied on. His career hung in precarious balance. Yet somehow, watching my son face these challenges with newfound clarity and resolve, I felt more hopeful than I had in months. Thomas had rediscovered something essential about himself in the crucible of this painful experience. A strength of character, a commitment to truth, a recognition of what truly mattered. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized that in trying to destroy him, Vanessa may have inadvertently helped Thomas become more fully himself than he had been in years, reconnected to his values, his true friends, his family, and perhaps most importantly, his own voice. Tomorrow would bring new battles. But tonight, my son was home, standing in his truth. And that was victory enough for now. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, autumn painted my garden in amber and gold as Thomas and I shared morning coffee on the porch swing. Sometimes it feels like another lifetime, Thomas remarked. Other times, like yesterday. So much had changed. After Vanessa's smear campaign cost him his job, Thomas had redirected his architectural skills toward affordable housing projects. The work paid less, but fulfilled him in ways his previous career never had. Rebecca now led a support group for victims of relationship fraud. Vanessa had left the city after her father's firm came under investigation. "Mom, we got it!" Thomas burst through the door that afternoon, waving approval documents for his community housing project. Full funding, immediate timeline approval. That weekend, our backyard filled with people who'd helped Thomas rebuild: Rebecca, Michael, Daniel, Andy, Beatrice, and Emma, the urban planner whose friendship with Thomas was cautiously blossoming into something more. Raising his glass as golden light filtered through changing leaves, Thomas offered a toast. To unexpected journeys, to the phone calls that change everything, and most of all, to the people who remind us who we really are when we've forgotten. The wedding he'd been excluded from never happened. Instead, something far more meaningful had emerged from its ashes. A journey of reconnection, redemption, and renewal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.